Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of LinkedIn Live Tech Cafe by Flintas. I am Mandar Navare. I am co-founder and CEO of Flintas. Along with me, I have Shohel as well. So, Shohel, please
Hey, hi,
introduce yourself.
yeah. Hi everyone. Shoel this side. I look after mostly pre-sales and delivery for Flentas, and I'm also one of the co-founders.
Thanks, Joel. So, as I think we discussed on a couple of topics earlier, the today's topic is the monitoring and the strategy for monitoring, right? So, uh, with after COVID, right, the digital become new normal. The cloud adoption has on the all-time high compared to last 10 years. And as the cloud is one of the largest pillar of digital, people have multiple workloads on multiple cloud. Okay, so they have all core applications on one cloud. Some applications are on premise. They have applications on AWS, Azure, Google, and it's a multi-cloud hybrid environment, right? And when we have a core application, it's very important to have uh, full-fledged monitoring strategy and monitoring implementation in place, right? So our first question to you, Joel, in such a fast-paced environment, such a complex workloads, right? Such a complex public cloud, such a availability of various environment, right? How do you define overall monitoring strategy? So can you share some thoughts and how to start with the monitoring, right? Where do we start? Help us on that thought.
Definitely. So you're right, Mandar. I think the monitoring strategy needs also a change because after the cloud, there are a lot of moving parts that have now come into the picture. More and more enterprises, startups, most of the companies get moving into cloud. It really, also makes sense to relook at how the monitoring strategy should be defined because things are different, uh, on cloud compared to the on-prem or traditional infrastructure, right? So with that, I'll try to cover just a gist, at least a couple of aspects that we need to consider before defining a monitoring strategy. So first and foremost is we need to look at who are the stakeholders, right? Who will be, looking at the monitoring, who will be basically, needing these monitoring metrics for their day-to-day, business activities, right? So these stakeholders can be from finance, it can be from security, it can be from DevOps, it can be from infosec, it can be from application team, infra team. It will also be higher management, CXOs, right? So we need to understand the needs of these stakeholders when it comes to defining a monitoring strategy, right? So it's no more only about technical people or DevOps people or IT support engineers who are the consumers of monitoring platforms or metrics, right? Now it has to be looked at from a holistic standpoint, right? So having the personas defined, like these stakeholders, we have to basically come up with the business outcomes, right, that these personas are interested in, right? uh, Based on the business outcome, right, your KPIs should be defined, right? uh, and then based on the KPI, you need to then look at what are the contributing factors in your application infrastructure security, which will basically impact these KPIs, right? And those will become your matrix, right? Once you find out your matrix, then you have to, dig down deep into, okay, what is the normal, working of these matrix? What good looks like, right? Then maybe you can define the thresholds, and put some alerts, and then your incident management processes, kick in, dashboarding and all those things kick in, right? So it should be more of a top to bottom approach, right? Your monitoring strategy should be defined in a top to bottom approach. By top to bottom, I mean to say that it should start with the business outcomes that we are looking at, right? That the stakeholders are looking at, and you have to basically pave your way backwards, and then understand what are the metrics and what are the thresholds, and how my nitty-gritties look like. Uh, Normally, what we have seen is monitoring strategies are defined bottom up, or in fact, these strategies, the monitoring implementations are looked at, merely like a bag of matrix, right? based on the technical components, there'll be a bunch of matrix that that are plotted on the dashboards, and then from these matrix, business stakeholders try to derive the KPIs, and then try to understand how the application is performing and multiple aspects of the application, which is not the right way. It should be a top to bottom rather than a bottom to up approach on a high level.
Okay. I think that makes sense. So important point is, I think we need to define persona, stakeholder, and it has to come from the top, so that monitoring will show some value to the end users. And so monitoring, high level, what I understand, right? So it's all about monitoring your infrastructure, right? Then so infra, it comes with all your CPU or compute or memory, all those infra parameters. Then we think of application monitoring, right? Monitoring specific applications or maybe web servers or any application components inside the servers, right? Then we talk about monitoring of compliances, end user, because on cloud now cost monitoring also becomes a very important factor, because on cloud cost is a variable factor. It's completely pay as you go. So you monitor your cost is also one of the important factor. Then comes the security along with compliance. Security is also one of the large component for monitoring, looking at current scenario, right? And current cyber security incidents and current trend and current exposure. I think security and compliance are also one of the very important aspects of monitoring. And then
Right.
come your third party applications, or third party APIs which your application is accessing, right? There are so many different components, right? And we have to monitor so many different components, right? We understand all these components will have a stakeholder and it will come down from a stakeholder, right? But if we have to monitor such a large number of parameters, right, how do we decide between the tooling, right, the tool set for monitoring, and how do we decide between open source versus licensed tools? Because there are so many different tools available and so many different parameters to monitor. Can you show some high level points on how do we select open source versus licensed tools?
Definitely. I think you're right, Mandar. There is, a lot to monitor nowadays. It's not just infra and application. Like we discussed earlier, it should be a holistic view, and you have to consider all these, different aspects. Like you just said, in while defining a monitoring strategy. But when it comes to tooling, right? Again, tooling is again the plethora of tools available, hundreds of tools available for solving a single problem, right? So we'll try not to get into the specifics of what tools can be used, but we'll touch upon what are the considerations you should be aware of before going with open source tool or a SaaS tool, right? So first and foremost is with an open source tool, there'll be a lot of infra setup and management which has to be done on a self basis, right? You have to do it on your own. If you're okay with having managing the infrastructure of the monitoring platform, right, and managing it also, right, and also monitoring the monitoring platform, right. That's another thing to it. So you have to
Wow.
basically consider that. If you're okay with that, you can go with open source. Uh, if you're not okay, SaaS tools definitely come without those heavy baggage. You just have to plug and play, and things should be up and running. Uh, Second aspect is there are a lot of out of the box features like anomaly detection, in your matrix, uh, noise suppression of alerts. Correct. So these, very niche features are available in a lot of SaaS tools, right, which are paid, essentially. Uh, so if if you're not choosing SaaS tools, and if you're choosing open source tools, you just have to be aware that there are a lot of such tools, such features which are important, right? Which are AI enabled monitoring. You can name it that. And all detection is nothing but there is some modeling to it, and it's basically AI enabled monitoring. So if you are aware that okay, if you're okay with, if you're not requiring such kind of a feature, then open source is fine, because what we have seen is open source tools, it can be implemented, but I don't think it's a straight path, just like a SaaS tool. So choose wisely. uh, Third point is the single dashboard, to handle almost all aspects of monitoring. With SaaS tools, it is very much possible. Again, I'll not say SaaS tools are like silver bullet to every problem. Uh, but more or less, you will be able to correlate between a lot of different aspects of monitoring, right, in a single tool, which is possible in SaaS tools, paid tools. But in the open source world, I think you will be a little scattered, when it comes to the tools that are available, right? So for logging, you might use something else. For matrix, you might use something else. For tracing and distributed tracing, right? Or service mapping, you might end up using something else. It will not be a consolidated view, but of course, there are successful companies and enterprises who are working off completely on the open source world. But yes, you need to know what you're getting into before selecting an open source tool for that. There's also an important aspect like automated remediation of issues, right? So these kind of features, like I said, right, are available and very much controlled, in the SaaS world, right? So if you are looking at automated remediations, and tracking that, right, open source tools, you can definitely build something on your own, but it will be hard to keep a track and build a system around it, so which will be possible completely on the SaaS tool, right? So I think these were all the points which were more, leaning towards selecting a SaaS tool. But there are also some downsides, and where open source tools might become more, might make more sense, right? So these are the points here, like data locality, right? So if you're selecting a SaaS tool which does not have a local presence in India, right? If you, of course, if you're into some business where regional local data storage is a must, right? You don't need to cross borders. Your data should not cross the borders. Then I think open source tools, we can definitely achieve that because they will be housed in your own infrastructure.
True.
Then the cost, right? So there are different units of cost, that are, I mean, there are different pricing models available in the proprietary and SaaS tools. Some are based on host based licensing, some are based on data volume based licensing. There'll be some who are based on purely number of events based, right? So you need to be sure, based on your business growth and your monitoring needs, if you're going to use some of these units to a large extent, right? And if you think that that is going to shoot the budget in next 6 months or 1 year, according to this pricing model, to a large extent, I think you should reconsider using an open source tool, because open source tool, effectively you will be just paying for the infrastructure, right? Because there is no license cost, or there is no other cost. uh, then
Correct.
there is vendor lock-in, which is an important point, right? With open source tools, again, vendor lock-in is there, but especially if you are aware, what you're using. Say, for example, using OpenTelemetry instead of native instrumenting agents, then I think you're in safe hands. But if you're using certain APM tools with agents which are proprietary, right? Then I mean it's more or less a lock-in that you're getting into, right? So you need to be aware of vendor lock-in when choosing the paid tools. I think those will be some of the considerations that one
I
should be aware of.
think pretty much very interesting points you made,
Yeah,
right? I like the point, and basically a comparison between open source and license, right? And specifically, viewers, if you want to go open source, remember this term: monitor the monitoring platform, right? So if you're
yeah,
going to open source, I think it's important. If you are going for the license, I think you need to consider the cost, data locality, and basically vendor lock-in, right? So compare these things, I think, and then able to choose wisely which tools to select. So we'll move towards the next question, right? The world is moving faster towards the technology, right? And a few years back, I think microservices architecture or distributed architecture were, one of the startups used to deploy, right? But now it has become a widespread. A lot of enterprises have adopted this kind of architecture, right? And when large enterprise adopt this kind of architecture with multiple applications hosted on multiple clouds, right? Uh, how do we understand, and how do we monitor this kind of distributed architecture? Are there any specific set of technologies available to overcome these challenges?
definitely. So I think you might be aware of this term called observability, a
Yeah,
lot nowadays. So
just heard
monitoring,
of it. Would love
yeah,
to know more.
correct. So observability, again, is an extension to monitoring, is what I will say. So monitoring is something which will help you track changes, in your matrix, which are known, right, with known values, right. Say, for example, there is, CPU, memory, or any other metric, right, which you are able to quantify, and you've already put an alert for that, which means you know those metrics. You are already aware what is the worst that is going to happen, right. So then it means that it's known. The issue is known. If there is an alert on a metric, that is monitoring, right? But observability, right, is something which will help you go beyond monitoring. Uh, so to say that, in putting in simpler terms, observability will help you debug and explore issues, right? When your monitoring matrix and alerts, won't might not help you much, right? So say, for example, there is a downtime, and your normal monitoring matrix that you have set up, they're not able to say much, right. They are pointing you to a few directions, but then you really don't know the underlying application nitty-gritties, and impact that application uh, is causing, right, for a particular issue. In that case, you need to get into a debugging and exploration mode, right. But to get into a debugging and exploration mode, you need to equip your engineers with a proper observability stack, right. And that is where, nowadays, with distributed architectures, it is very important to have a proper observability setup with 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 capabilities of distributed logging, distributed tracing, correlation between logging, which should be very much possible, and custom matrix, which should be which should be directly pushed from the application into some central dashboards, right. So if you are able to understand the pulse of the application, which is totally possible only if you have a proper solid tracing and logging in place, is when you can say that, okay, you have the tools available for your engineers to solve a particular issue. So that has become very much important nowadays, because the application context is not residing in one server. It is now distributed across
Yeah.
multiple services in a service oriented world. Yeah.
Got it. So I think observability is important factor. It go bit different than traditional monitoring, but I think it is important in today's digital world. So I think we have spoke on high level monitoring. The next question is fairly simple, fairly common, right? So if organization wants to implement a full fledged monitoring, right, for their workloads, right, what are the common consideration best practices? So can you share some more thoughts around what are the standard practices to be followed while implementing such a large scale
Okay.
monitoring strategy for the organization?
Definitely. I mean, since there is a lot to monitor and a lot of aspects, I will try to at least put forth few points which come in my mind, which is very much important, and which can be covered in the time duration of this of this LinkedIn live session. So the first and foremost is your application. I mean, your application monitoring dashboards, right? Your dashboards, which are being used by your support team, needs to have a contextual bound, right? Your monitoring dashboard should be application centric. When I say application centric, all your metrics, which are responsible, which can impact your particular application, all those metrics should be present in a single dashboard, right? Which will help your team to correlate metrics, across the infrastructure, but also at the same time making sure that we are able to correlate between different metrics and not going out of the bound of a specific application context, right? So this becomes very important. Uh, for as far as distributed tracing is concerned, right? Uh, we have seen monolith applications, right? Which are implementing very complex telemetries, and distributed tracing, frameworks. Uh, when you are on a monolith application, right? If it's your application is basically residing on a single server, there is really no need of having distributed tracing there, because your application request is not going beyond a server or process boundary, right? So in that sense, there is really no need of having tracing enabled for monolith applications. Is what a simpler explanation would be. Um, if you have distributed architecture, if you have service oriented architecture, if you have multiple microservices, right, totally different processes, talking to each other, and spread across, you definitely need distributed tracing. But my recommendation would be, so again, there are a lot of tracing libraries, instrumentation libraries available in the market, but the only recommendation here is use those, but try to use those which support open telemetry standard, because OpenTelemetry is now being considered as a standard approach uh, for basically pushing your instrumentation matrix into any kind of backend. So if basically you use OpenTelemetry compliant library or OpenTelemetry library itself, you are basically safe as far as interoperability is concerned, because you are then compatible automatically with a lot of SaaS tools and open source tools like Jaeger or Neuralink or any tool you say, right? I mean, all these tools are moving forward towards supporting open telemetry. So that is must recommendation from my side. Uh, as far as third parties are concerned, right? So there'll be a lot of services which will be under our control. There might be few services which we are consuming out of third party, right? And we also need to monitor those third party services. For that, external health checks are required. So those external health checks should not be just a network call, because network call is merely earlier for confirmation that okay, you are able to establish connectivity, but you need to really look at layer 7 kind of calls for health checks, which actually checks the real up whether the application is really up or not, the third party application, and hence
Okay.
then you can decide whether you should basically rely on that service or not, right, or fail fast on your own service. uh, Fourth is monitoring of on-host components, right? Uh, so there are a lot of components like web servers, the database servers, which are still being deployed on VMs, right? Traditional VMs. If you have a database hosted on a traditional VM, a web server like HA Proxy, Nginx, Tomcat, deployed on a normal host, right? It becomes important to monitor these specific components, right? And not just the infrastructure components like CPU, disk, memory, right? You need to monitor specific metrics available to these components, because these components again are very complex pieces, and they also emit a lot of metrics which needs to be monitored, right? And sadly, problem is you know uh, there are very few open source tools who support, they have ready integration with all the open source components that we are talking about. So Prometheus is one of them, which supports a lot of integrations to these components like web servers or database servers, but there are very few apart from Prometheus who support direct integrations with this. You probably have to end up going with a paid tool like Datadog or Neuralink for monitoring these components. Um, I think one more thing, right? So if you
Yeah.
have, say, for example, you're using something like Kubernetes, right? Containers. You have microservice architecture, and you're using Istio or Envoy-based proxies, right? Uh, so the beauty is, you really don't need to do any kind of application instrumentation as far as tracing is concerned, because these tools directly support OpenTelemetry, and you just have to integrate OpenTelemetry with the Istio or Envoy proxy, and you really don't need to touch your code, from an instrumentation perspective. So I think for those who are using, service proxies or service meshes, try not to integrate the instrumentation in your services, and just
Got
I think you should offload it to the service mesh. Yeah,
Okay.
I think those are few of the
Yep.
recommendations.
I think a lot of interesting points. One that caught my attention is the open telemetry standard. So I think it's
Yeah,
very important to have some standard in monitoring practices, and I think it's good that industry is evolving and defining this kind of standard, which will help everyone to come on the similar standard and choose and pick a specific tool set and specific technical stack. So a lot of good insights So next question, basically, we have seen a lot of companies are opting for serverless technologies, right? Compared to a traditional compute. So traditional compute, we can consider everything like your VM or containers or a traditional bare metal server, right? We know it's a server at the end. Where in serverless, we have no clue, right, where the server is. It's completely off the radar. So, how does monitoring changes depend on your application is serverless or it's hosted on server?
Right. So I think as far as serverless compute is concerned, right, I'll focus on AWS Lambda and Azure functions of the world, right. Uh,
Yeah.
so the way you have to think of monitoring here is there is really no, there is CPU of course, but it's under the sheets. What you really have to be vigilant about is the number of invocations that it supports, right. So there are a lot of limits, when it comes to using serverless compute from these, cloud vendors. Uh, so it's, I mean, though they claim it to be infinitely scalable, and they are, but they are not readily infinitely scalable, right? You have to be aware of the limits that are there on your specific cloud subscriptions or accounts, which
Okay.
basically because there are default quotas to it, right? So number of invocations of your Lambda, right? There is a quota to it. Number of invocations per second, right? That you can do. There is again a soft quota to it. The duration, right, of the execution of the Lambda, right? So there is a limit to it, right? So before designing, or deploying your application here, you need to first be aware of these limitations, and you also need to be aware of again, these limitations are soft limits. There is no hard limit to it, but you need to be aware of it, right? Because tomorrow if you are going in production, and you don't know, you're not aware of these limits, and you've not put any monitoring on these limits, right, on the serverless components, then it becomes difficult for you to predict, because it'll essentially fail if you have a lot of users coming in on the first day. Your Lambda will basically stagger, and it will not be able to scale as much, right, because of these soft limits. So you need to be aware of these, and from monitoring perspective, these are the metrics that you should focus on when it comes to monitoring serverless, components of cloud infrastructure. Right. Uh,
Got it.
yeah, I think that will be one of
Yeah,
the
so I
inputs.
think it's important to understand the limits. Otherwise, all the purpose to go serverless would be defeated if you
Correct.
don't know the limits of Lambda or those functions. And then we'll come to the last question of this session. I think we discussed a lot about monitoring, right? We discussed about the practice, strategy, and the tools, and observability and various different parameters, right? And I think it's a lot of work, looking at. So the question is, how do we implement such a large monitoring strategy, right? Is it easy to do it in house, or is it better to outsource to the external team?
Okay. Yeah, I think. See, I mean, depends on the maturity and the team maturity, basically, that is there. Awareness of so many tools, and more than awareness, it's about you know connecting these dots, right? Uh, there might be people who are very much, who are experts in specific tool, right? But expertise on a specific monitoring tool will really not help, when it comes to defining a monitoring strategy which is holistic in nature, right? So I think someone who has experience, on handling uh, difficult situations, when it comes to application troubleshooting, monitoring, right? uh, uh, Also, building infrastructure governance frameworks, right? Implementing infrastructure governance frameworks, right? Monitoring the infrastructure in tandem with the application, and also taking care of the holistic view, right? I think that is what is required here. Again, it's a very vague answer, but uh, I mean, there is no straight answer to this. In a nutshell, it's more about the understanding and the interconnectedness of these multiple components which are at play here, and not
Got
just
it.
a know-how of a specific tool which will really help here, right?
Correct. So what I understood is, I think connecting the dots is important.
Yeah,
Understanding application is important. Understanding the business user is
yeah,
important. Understanding the customer is important. And on top of that,
yeah,
understanding of tool will come into the picture,
correct,
right? Yeah. So I
correct.
think you need multiple things, and expert on multiple different angles to implement this kind of monitoring strategy. So
Correct.
great. I think here we come to an end to the session. Thanks a lot, Joel, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone.
and thank you, everyone. Please share your feedback, and do let us know if you want to know any specific queries on any technology topic. We would love to cover it in our next session. If you have any questions, please send us over the email or comment on the same LinkedIn live. Thank you again, and see ya in the next season. Thank you.
Bye.